So here we are in this place that I would never have thought had anything to do with slavery.
Mm.
Um, but actually, that indicates how important slavery was
Yeah,
at the time.
it's a
Um,
hidden thing.
and I keep saying slavery, but the chapter is called Unfreedom,
Mm.
which I thought, is that just a euphemism or what? Why are you calling it Unfreedom? Like, call
Yeah.
it what it is?
We are calling it what it is. The thing is, slavery existed in the early modern world on a continuum of different stages of freedom. Or not stages, that's the wrong word, but different levels of freedom. And we tend to think of today in a liberal world that you're either free or you're not free. But in that time period, that wasn't the case. So free people existed at one end of the spectrum, and slaves existed at another end of the spectrum. But in the middle, there was lots of other possibilities. The most obvious of those is indentured servitude. And there's lots of indentured servitude in British North America in the 18th and 19th centuries. And what happens in indentured servitude is that the person voluntarily, and that makes it really quite different from slavery, voluntarily enters into a contract where they give up their freedom for a period of time. So I would sign a contract with you, and you would be my master. They would call it actually they do call it a master because the master-servant relationship that comes directly from that. So legislation, which we still call master-servant relationships, come from that framework. So in that relationship, you would be giving me something. You would train me in something. It would be like an apprenticeship. So, for example, a blacksmith, I would learn how to. You would teach me to be a blacksmith. So I would give you my labor for 5 years, and you would teach me how to be a blacksmith, and I could go off and become an independent blacksmith. So that was that was an accepted part of life for many, particularly poor people, as a way to raise themselves up. So it was, but it's voluntary. Slavery is not a voluntary thing. Slavery is somebody forcing you into that, and it's not for a period of time. It's for the rest of your life. You become not, and students say this all the time, and I'm always uncomfortable when I hear this. They say if they were treated like they were property. No, they were not like property. They were property. This book is a thing. A slave is a thing in a legal context, and that's a really hard thing, I think, for us to get our heads around, because it really really points to a wholly different sense of human and what it means to be human in this time period.
And because there was this spectrum of unfreedoms, as we will call them, as I am learning to call them, um, it, that opened up opportunities for some people to find pathways to freedom because some of them were less free and more free, and so that they could, like, it was definitely a difference between how you lived your life in this unfreedom.
I have to give you one of these answers that you're going to hate because you're kind of right and you're kind of wrong.
Okay.
So it does open up possibilities, but it's a really complex, messy situation. So just to go to the kind of most obvious thing, what you seem to be suggesting is that there might be a route to freedom for a slave. And there is. There's a process called manumission where somebody can buy themselves or somebody can buy you out of slavery. It's basically a cash exchange. I buy this person's freedom. And that does happen. But in the British and French system, it's actually kind of hard for that to happen. In the United States, it doesn't happen very often at all. In Spanish and Portuguese societies, it happens fairly routinely. So that if you look at some of the slave islands in the Caribbean, Brazil, they have high rates of manumission. So Brazil, when slavery is outlawed in the 19th century, over a third of the society is actually already free. They've purchased their freedom in some fashion. Oh, sorry, over a third rather of the African American population in Brazil. So there are possibilities there. Where we do see it in our readings is on the indigenous side, where you see quite a range of possibilities there. And it's, I think first off, a lot of our students still don't know that slavery existed in Canada at all. And those that did tend to think of it only in terms of African Americans, but there was also an Indigenous slave system. And part of that was rooted in Indigenous society, and part of it was the colonists and the settlers capturing Indigenous people and making them slaves. So there was kind of a mixture there. But we see certainly right here in Niagara in the Lake, I showed you in the screencast that ad showing the runaway ad. Most runaway ads are for African American slaves. This was for an Indian slave. So somebody in this town in the 1790s owned at least one Indian slave. So even that existed in this time period. But within Indigenous societies, and our readings are really good at showing us that, you see the different possibilities that exist. Some of those slaves become full adopted members of those societies. They become embraced by those societies. Some of them die. There's a range of possibilities. So yeah, there are paths that are different paths in the story, and it's certainly not a simple you're a slave, you're not a slave situation. But within African American slavery, the options were limited. And Chloe's story gets at that too, because we didn't highlight this enough in the last video. She resists. I mean, she goes literally kicking and screaming, and that attention is what makes people notice what's going on. So she is playing a part in her own story there. She's got very limited resources available to her, but she's trying to make the best of them.
I had a hard time with this whole chapter because all of it made me very uncomfortable. And reading about Chloe, who's not in the chapter, but if you look it up, you'll see. And also, I mean, the Jesuit accounts or
the relations.
The relations. See, I thought it was their relations with the indigenous
people.
They're
relating their story.
They're relating the story. So the relations are them telling the story. Okay. So the Jesuit relations, I found, or this in particular, Hennepin's, really hard to read. It was quite like gross, grotesque, and barbaric, and it made me really uncomfortable because I feel like it's a settler's account.
Yeah, absolutely. We see this in colonial history all the time, that by and large, and this doesn't matter whether we're talking about India or Africa or America with indigenous people, colonial accounts are almost always through the eyes of the colonizer rather than of the colonized. And this is one of those instances. So it's really all we have to work in terms of documentary evidence to work with. Certainly there are indigenous oral accounts that paint very different pictures. So what we have to do is look at those accounts and apply the critical thinking skills that we apply to any historical account. Is this actually true? Is this factually true? We know from professional historians who read much more broadly of these accounts, we know that some of those accounts are deliberately exaggerated. Sometimes the editors back in France amplify them to make them more interesting because they're trying to sell these things. These are books for sale. It's not just somebody's letter back home. So they try to ramp up the story. They try to make it more exciting. So we know for a fact that some of this is exaggerated. We also know for a fact that some of it isn't. So finding that ground of what's true in there really requires, and again, we're talking about historians, we're talking about interpretation, we're talking about the fact that we use our minds to figure this stuff out. It's not just transparently on the page. We need to engage in thoughtful consideration of these things. And I think that document's a really good example of that. It paints a very disturbing picture. But we know for a fact other things were going on. So it's finding the truth in all that's hard.
Painting a picture, as Henderson points out, and he quotes Garneau saying that, in his History of Canada, or Histoire de Canada.
Very good.
Thank you. That, we happily escaped the terrible curse of Negro slavery, and yet we read all these other accounts, and that's absolutely not true.
Right.
And if I think of, a lot of, historical documents or textbooks that we've been given, there aren't accounts of this. So it's really interesting and, shocking and unsettling.
The 19th century is the century that in Great Britain and France, we decide that slavery is morally abhorrent. It must be stopped. And these accounts are written in the wake of that. And it's one of these really great examples where it shows the bias of the present moment in reading the past. It's one of these moments where they really can't accept the fact that we did that too. It was the Spanish that did that. It was the Portuguese that did that, not the English and the French. They did. The British are by far the most important players in the international slave trade in the 18th century, by far. And because they control the oceans. That's part of the Royal Navy. That's part of the whole thing of empire. And yet they painted this picture that literally whitewashed the story, literally took slavery out of that story. It wasn't here. It was here. And again, we can get into relativistic arguments. It wasn't as big here as it was in the States. It wasn't as big here as it was in Brazil. But it was still here. And thousands of people were enslaved on this ground, worked these fields, cut down these trees, built these buildings. They are part of the fabric of building this colony. And we ignore that at our peril. We miss a lot when we pretend that didn't happen. Not just in the physical contributions that they made, but in our own moral sense of who we are as a people. We want to believe that we've always been that way. Well, we weren't. We've changed. We've evolved. I think there's a good story there. It means that we actually learned something. We figured something out. Yeah. And Lord knows racism has continued in many ways, but we're still, and it's an ongoing project. There's no doubt about that. I don't want to whitewash our present. But at the same time, there is something significant changing in human society there, and that's worth talking about and understanding.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. It's an interesting chapter, even though it was difficult.
Well, one of the things that is great about history is that it forces us to confront some of those uncomfortable moments, that allows us to see that, this is Canada 150 this year. I guess we're giving away, we're not supposed to give away when we shoot these things, but this is Canada, this is 2017, it's Canada 150 this year, and we're celebrating all these things. And we should celebrate things. Canada is a good place. There are fabulous things to celebrate here. There's no doubt about that. But there's other things too, and we need to just bring that into our story, understand that, know its place, know what it means to be in this place with that history.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
All right.